in a new world. So also the Red Sea, Exodus, separated the Israelites from their past slavery and suffering and allowed them to make a new beginning in the land of Canaan. The third period in the history of the Jewish nation, this history of restoration, the Old Testament history, was a 120-year period of the United Kingdom. It began from King Saul. During the 40 years of his reign, Saul was to lay the foundation of faith by what? By respecting the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic law, by building the temple, by uniting the people around one tradition of faith in preparation for the Messiah. This would have been accomplished through the building of the temple. However, when Saul became faithless, God's will to build the temple was prolonged through the two 40-year reigns of David and Solomon. Thus, the period of the United Kingdom was prolonged to 120 years. Now, this is obviously parallel to the three generations of Abraham's family in the earlier period, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Just as the dispensation, which began with Abraham, was prolonged through Isaac and Jacob, God's dispensation with King Saul was extended to King David and King Solomon. The next period in the Old Testament or restorational era was a period of 400 years of divided kingdoms. This period where the Israelite kingdom was divided into two reflects the 40-year period in Abraham's family's course where the brothers were divided in two. Now, this period began when the United Kingdom in Israel was divided after Solomon into the northern kingdom of Israel, where there were 10 tribes and more unrighteous kings, and the southern kingdom of Judah, where there were 2 tribes and more righteous kings. This period lasted until the people of Judah were taken into exile in Babylon. In fact, the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, were decimated by the Assyrians, as we'll discuss later. We're going to talk about the details of all of these periods a little bit later. The northern kingdom decimated by the Assyrians. History refers to them as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But the remnant, the 2 tribes in Judah, also fell into faithlessness, and they were taken into captivity in Babylon at the end of this period. This period is parallel to the 40 years from when Jacob purchased the birthright from Esau until he received the blessing of Isaac and God before leaving for Haran. The 40 years of divided brothers, 400 years of divided kingdoms. The next period of Old Testament history, this foundational period of restoration, was the 210-year period of Israel's exile and return. The people of Judah sinned against God. As a result, they were taken into exile in Babylon for 70 years. The Persians then defeated the Babylonians, and King Cyrus liberated the Jews, and they began a gradual return to Jerusalem. Once they returned under Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuilt their temples and walls. Malachi prophesied the coming of Elijah and to be followed by the Messiah, and they began preparations to receive their promised king. Now, this period was parallel to the 21-year period when Jacob left Canaan until his return, restoring that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. Now, it's interesting to note that Jacob's exile was also initially 7 years, like the 70 years of the Jewish exile in Babylon. 7 years in Haran, he was promised by his uncle Laban to be given his daughter Rachel in marriage. But Laban tricked Jacob, gave him his older daughter. So Jacob had to labor another 7 years for the hand of Rachel and another 7 years for wealth and prosperity. A 7-year course that became 21 years, like the later 210-year exile of the Jews. The final period of Old Testament history was the 400-year period of preparation for the coming of the Messiah. This from Malachi until Jesus. After the Jewish people returned from exile, until the birth of Jesus, they reestablished their faith And based on Malachi's prophecy that Elijah would come, followed by the Messiah, they began as a nation to prepare for his coming. They restored the law as the center of Jewish tradition. They restored worship in the temple, the school of the Pharisees, and a strong tradition waiting for the day when the Lord would come. Now, this period was parallel to the 40-year period from Jacob's return to Canaan until Jacob's family reunited in Egypt, centering on Joseph. And it restored that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. So we can see that this pre-Old Testament era, which formed the foundation for the providence of restoration. Please remember, during that period, because human beings had fallen so low, deceitful above all things, there was no foundation to receive God's word. And so no commandments or laws, but human beings related to God through offerings, the best of our flock, the best of our crop. However, this period was paralleled by the later Old Testament age, centered on the Ten Commandments and the Jewish laws. We can see the clear process of restoration through indemnity. Next, let us consider the next age in the providence of restoration. Now, up until now, we've been discussing the parallels and patterns and ages as described in the Bible. But if Christian history inherited the same mission, shouldn't it also then parallel the history of the Old Testament? Would it be possible that this history outside of the Bible follows the same pattern, the same ages, the same process as biblical history? If so, we would have to recognize the hand of a loving and wise God working behind the events of history. Let's take a look. Let's consider the periods and their lengths in the age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration. We remember that this pre-Old Testament age made the foundation. The Old Testament age, the age of restoration, paralleled it. Now, as a result of the crucifixion, another age was necessary. Jesus came, we now understand, as the Messiah to be received by the prepared people of Israel, to establish a kingdom with justice and with righteousness, to sit on the throne of David, to rule over his kingdom, and that the people of all nations would come and learn God's way, that the kingdom of God would be established at that time. However, because of the crucifixion, Jesus met with faithlessness. He was rejected, misunderstood, never acknowledged as the very Messiah that the people were waiting for, sent to the cross. Therefore, the providence of Christianity came about as a restoration of this earlier period. The age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration is a substantial parallel to the age of restoration. Therefore, the corresponding periods will proceed in a parallel fashion, both in order and in length. If so, it will give us deeper insight into the significance of the providence of restoration. Now, in later presentations, we're going to discuss the details of each of these ages and how they paralleled. But now let's just look at the formation and length of the ages and the basic symmetry between them. We know the age of restoration, the Old Testament era, 400 years of slavery in Egypt, 400 years of the tribes being ruled by judges, 100 years of a united kingdom, the 400 years of divided kingdoms, the 210 years of exile and return, and finally a 400-year period of preparation to receive the Messiah. Let's now look at the development of the later ages and how it followed the same course. The first period of Christian history outside of the Bible, but able to be viewed in recorded history, was a 400-year period of Roman persecution. During this period, the Roman Empire persecuted Christians. Ultimately, Emperor Constantine began the change when he formally recognized Christianity's right to exist as a legal religion in 313. But ultimately, it was 392 when the Emperor Theodosius established Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. This period was parallel to the Israelites' 400-year period of slavery in Egypt. Its purpose was to restore that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. Now, the next period of Christian history, of New Testament history, was the 400-year period of regional church leadership. In this period, the people were led by regional church leaders, patriarchs, bishops, and abbots, with multiple roles corresponding to the judges in the earlier period in Israel. The purpose of this period was to restore that earlier period of judges through parallel indemnity conditions. In the Old Testament era, just as the 12 tribes had moved in and divided Israel into lands under each of the tribes, so also in the New Testament era, the Christian realm was divided into 5 holy sees. And like the time of the tribes, when the strongest of the tribal leaders was made the judge, so also the strongest of the patriarchs of these 5 sees became the Pope. There are other parallels which we'll discuss in detail in our next presentation. The next period of Christian history was the 120-year period of Christian empire. His name was Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. His goal was to build St. Augustine's city of God, and to realize a godly Christian empire, which he envisioned as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this 120-year period of Christian empire, also called the Carolingian Empire, began with Charlemagne's enthronement as emperor on Christmas Day in 800 AD. This united empire ended 119 years later, when Charlemagne's royal line ceased. His grandsons conflicted and divided the empire. It ended in the eastern half of the realm, and Henry I was elected king of the German lands. The purpose of this period was to restore the earlier 120-year United Kingdom of Israel through parallel indemnity conditions. The next period in Christian history, we'll learn, was the 400-year period of divided kingdoms. The Carolingian Empire was divided into 2 kingdoms: the Eastern Franks, which became the Holy Roman Empire, and the Western Franks, which became the Kingdom of France. This period was the parallel to the 400-year period when the Israelite kingdom was divided between Judah in the south and the 2 tribes there, and Israel in the north and the 10 tribes there, restoring that earlier period through parallel indemnity conditions. The next period of Christian history was, amazingly, a 210-year period of papal exile and return. The 210-year period of exile and return of the Pope restored through parallel indemnity conditions the earlier period of Judah's exile and return. It began in 1309 AD, when Pope Clement V was literally kidnapped, forced to move the papacy from Rome to Avignon in France, and to live there subject to the kings of France. How long was the papacy in France? 68 years, until 1377, when Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome. However, after the papacy returned to Rome, the confusion and conflict did not end. The next pope was rejected by a group within the church, and another pope was elected. These 2 were arguing until a third arose and said the other 2 are not legitimate. This papal schism caused great confusion, and this period of political fighting and struggle continued until the Protestant Reformation in 1517. The final period of Christian history, beginning from Martin Luther, is a 400-year period of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah. A parallel 400-year period of preparation for the Messiah began in 1517 with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. This period lasted until the eve of the second advent of Christ on the earth. The purpose of this period was to restore the earlier period of preparation for the first advent. We can see the distinct parallels between these 2 periods. This final 400 years brought us onto the doorstep of the 20th century, the beginning of the first of several world wars, which Jesus said in Matthew 24 would be the signs of his coming. Wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. This 400-year period brought us to the establishment of communism, the first of a number of tyrannical movements, including Nazism and other fascist efforts in the 20th century, anti-God, ultimately anti-Christian, and therefore ultimately anti-Christ. The 20th century and this era of tremendous struggle was the struggle to end the old history and begin a new history. So we see that the 2,000 years of the history of Israel, the Old Testament age, recorded in the Bible, was paralleled by the 2,000 years of Christian history, recorded outside the Bible. It is therefore possible for us to recognize that a loving and wise God has been working through the process of human history, not by arbitrarily making people do this or that or controlling events, but through the principle of restoration that governs the process of our struggle to return. In our next presentation, we're going to look at these two providential periods, the history of Israel and the history of Christianity, in greater detail, and we'll only see more clearly how these periods paralleled, and understand more deeply the process by which God is working to restore his children and fulfill his original purpose of creation. Thank you very much.